Library of the Living Dead now presents A Done in One by author David Dunwoody. This is called Saligia. For some reasons Alan wasn't interested in, Molly had decided to go to the baptism of her ex's firstborn. She had tried to convince him all week to come along, and made one last plea as she stood on the threshold. "You're the religious one of the two of us," she said, smiling wryly. "I thought you and Cal got along anyway." "I don't like church," Alan replied, parked in his recliner as the pregame show wrapped up before him. "It's not a 3-hour service. It's just..." "I'm gonna watch the game," Alan said. He heard a soft sigh. Then the front door closed. He waited until the sound of her car receded from earshot before getting out of the chair. Turning the TV off, Alan walked at a brisk pace across the den, through the dining room and kitchen, and down into the basement. It was used mostly for storage of odds and ends, though Molly had spoken a month or so ago about setting up her never-realized candle-making business down there. Alan gritted his teeth at the thought. Maneuvering through stacks of boxes, he reached the door to his darkroom and produced a key. There was no darkroom. It was a brightly lit room with bare walls and a thin armoire at the rear. Slipping off his clothes, Alan opened the armoire and carefully removed the black clothing from inside. Once changed, he reached into the bottom of the wardrobe for one last item. Fashioned like a set of brass knuckles, but with thick, ripping claws attached, the cat's paw was a reproduction of a popular tool used during the Inquisition. Slipping it over his gloved hand, he felt a surge of power rushing through his veins, straightening his posture, making him hard. Pride, he thought, chastising himself, and tucked the cat's paw back into its box. The box went into the inner pocket of his coat. He drove into the city in silence. No radio, no self-talk, just the thoughts in his head cycling over and over and over. In his mind, he heard the heretic's cry, saw the flash of the cat's paw, felt the splash and tasted the tang of hot blood. Parking in the large garage, he walked the last block, quickly sighting the high-rise as it towered, prideful, over the rest of the buildings. The elevator inside was garish, all mirrors with buttons set into the glass. He pressed the button for the top floor and stood alone. He looked at his reflection in the mirrored doors. He saw the demon. It bore a sickly green pallor beneath hair damped with sweat, ragged breasts whistling between long broken fangs. Its bloodshot eyes bulged from their sockets, staring directly at him. It wore his clothes. It said his name. Its black tongue rasped like sandpaper over those jagged teeth. Very few were able to perceive the demon in themselves. Some who did tried to chase it away by reciting prayers or counting on rosaries. These were hollow, scripted practices, prescribed in churches led not by God, but by men. It explained as much to Molly, though he could never tell her about the demon. That matter was between himself and God. The bell rang. The doors parted. Now, redemption. Claudia Di Lorenzo lived in a ridiculous penthouse that bespoke her greed. She would be alone. Her husband was on a plane, leaving for New York, and her lover would not arrive for another 2 hours. He slipped the cat's paw onto his hand. Now was the moment of greatest temptation. He could not let himself succumb to wrath, lest this all be for nothing. Closing his eyes, sucking in a deep breath, he reached out with his other hand and pressed the buzzer. The intercom cracked. "Who is it?" "Alan Marsh from your husband's office. I need to drop off some papers." "Oh, hello, Alan." The voice sounded tired, irritated. "Just a moment." The door opened, and she stood there, drunkenly, with her hair half done and a silk robe thrown over her negligee. Her sloth was sickening. Alan wasted no time in sweeping the paw across her face. She threw her hands before her, crying out, and stared at him in confusion. Then the lens of her left eye parted, and a jellied mass oozed out, and 3 great wounds opened in her face, and the blood began to pour, and she screamed. He pushed his way inside and slashed her across the chest. She flailed, gibbering, and tripped over a potted plant set against the wall. Alan fell upon her and finished it with a single stroke across the throat. There was blood everywhere. He looked. So much blood, and it was spreading still. He wiped the claws on his shredded robe and got up. There were spots of crimson on his sleeves, but they were almost imperceptible against the midnight black. He replaced the claw in its box. A shout from the living room brought his head snapping up. He froze and listened. It sounded like it might be the television, but he had to be sure. Alan crept into the room and saw that the TV was indeed on. It was the game. He smiled in relief, watching his son batter from some team hit a pop fly. The announcer declared it a foul, and sure enough, it came down in the stands behind home plate. The camera zoomed in on the scrambling fans. Alan shook his head in amusement. He heard the sound of the TV first. It drowned out the cheers of the crowd and the prattling of the announcer. It was a heavy, booming sound, the sound of a single drumbeat across the heavens. Then he heard it in the sky outside the penthouse. The sound faded. Alan glanced back at the TV. The game was being played in another time zone. How could he have heard? The camera was still tight on the fans behind home. They'd stopped flailing for the foul ball. Something was wrong. Something had changed. Half of them were dead and gray, and standing stock still in the stands as the others stared at them in horror. They looked like dried-out husks, dressed only in brown tatters, all of them the same, and they all seemed to be frozen. "What?" the announcer muttered. What in the... The dead came to life and tore into the living. It was a melee in the stands. Thousands of screams now audible over the air. Men and women and children being ripped apart by the gnarled claws of the dead. Alan saw skeletal faces smeared with blood, saw teeth pulling at loose flaps of skin on people's faces, saw crimson jets as throats were torn, heads pulled off. He turned away and ripped the gloves from his hands and clawed at his eyes. The images were burned into his retinas. He could still see the little boy who'd retrieved the ball, holding the bloody prize over his head and shrieking as his entrails were spilled. Half those people had changed in an instant, in a beat, into monsters. Zombies. He jumped as the cell phone rang. Alan shoved his hands into his pockets and wrenched them around in search of the sound, trying to silence it, somehow fearful that the dead might hear it and come for him. The TV was still on. He could still hear the screams, the announcer yelling now. He had to stop the sounds. He found the phone and cried, "What?" "Alan!" It was Molly. He could tell immediately that she was hysterical. "Alan, oh my God, everyone's dead. They became dead. Everyone in the church, Alan, and more in the streets, and they took the baby and..." She broke down in gasping sobs. It sounded like she was running. Then he heard the jingle of keys and a car door slam. "Alan, what do I do? Alan, what do I do?" "Home. Get home." "I called you at home and you weren't there. Alan, where were you?" "Just get home, Molly," he shouted and dropped the phone because revelation was sweeping over him. The rapture. It's the rapture. He looked down at his trembling hands, and the next thought nearly broke him to his knees. Why am I still here? He stumbled into the front hall, over Claudia's body, staggered before a full-length mirror on the wall, and saw the demon. He thrust his hands into the air above him and screamed. Something scratched the door. The scream died in Alan's throat. He walked on tiptoes to the door and, ever so gingerly, pressed his face to the peephole. Sunken yellow eyes stared back at him. He backpedaled and fell over Claudia, landing on his back in a pool of blood. He yanked the box from his coat and the cat's paw clattered across the floor. The scratching continued, soft but insistent. as the thing on the other side had all the time in the world. And it did. "There's no way out of here. I have to go out there. I have to." He pressed his face into the blood-stained floor and wept. The scratching grew longer, deeper. It knew he was inside. It hungered for him. Why was he being punished like this? He'd tried his whole life to redeem himself. Mother had shown him the way when he'd caught her. He'd caught her over Father's corpse, knife in hand, and saw the terrible hatred in her eyes, and she'd straightened up and slit her own throat. He had abstained from sin, had punished the heretics. What more could he do? Was it God's will that he suffer and die with the demon still in his blood? Pulling the cat's paw over his hand, he closed his fist. This had to be a last test. He would not falter. Alan stood up, went to the door, and pulled it open. The corpse stared dully at him, hands at its side. He roared and buried the claws in the thing's forehead. Its eyes rolled back and it slumped to the floor, pulling his hand down with it. He jerked the paw free and ran for the elevator. Hell had erupted in the streets. Cars were bouncing off one another and plowing into storefronts. Alan stayed pressed flat against the side of the building as a vehicle streaked past, running up onto the sidewalk. He caught a glimpse of the horror within, a dead mother clawing at her little girl. The car struck an abandoned police cruiser. The mother and child were thrown through the windshield. A man ran at Alan, his face a yawning red maw, blubbering, "Help! Help!" Alan swung the claw into the side of his head and sent him hurtling to the pavement. There was no hesitation. All around him were sinners and heretics. The only righteous on this earth were now gone, their bodies animated by the Lord's wrath. A cluster of zombies were shuffling down the sidewalk towards him. Spotting a gap in the wrecked cars filling the streets, he broke into a run. There was a small Baptist church on the other side. With no regard for possible consequences, he burst through its door. Pew after pew after pew of dead, but not all undead. The zombies feasted on their wicked brethren. A dead preacher shambled down from the pulpit, wrapped his arms around a bloody woman in the front row, biting into her face. What must it have been like when the drum sounded, when the congregation turned, when those left behind found themselves sandwiched between silent, staring corpses? Had anyone been able to escape? In answer, a hand closed on his shoulder. He cried out and turned to swipe the claw. It was a young woman. She was a brunette, like Molly. Her long hair was matted with blood that dripped into her brown eyes and over ruby lips. Yet she was beautiful. It was an obscenity to feel such lust in a church, even one that had been turned by God himself into a charnel house. But Alan couldn't help it, or rather, didn't try to, and he lowered the claw. "Please," she whispered. Shame flushed his face, beating back his feelings of desire. He grabbed her hand and pulled her towards the door. "No! No!" she screamed. "I can't go out there! No!" Alan looked back. The undead saw them now. They were slowly filing out of the pews, forming a mob in the aisle. They began to shuffle forward. Alan pulled the girl outside and forced her down the steps into the street. There were dead climbing out of the crashed cars on all sides. "We've got to go around them," Alan yelled, and pushed her forward into the slaughter. They wriggled beneath the vehicles as best they could, trying to avoid the zombies scattered throughout. Alan swung his claw madly at those who came close, taking off a rotted nose here, 3 fingers there. The girl sobbed, clutching at his coat, but did not panic enough so as to run into the arms of the undead. It was strange how uniform the corpses looked. Each appeared as if it had been loosed from an ancient tomb, with only the crumbling remains of robes hanging off its gaunt frame. But there was no time to ponder the mystery. They were closing in. There was no way to evade them. Alan and the girl stood back to back in the middle of the street and looked frantically for an escape. Any escape. Alan felt the girl tugging at him. Resigned to his fate, he turned to wrap his arms around her and whisper final words of comfort before the dead reached them. they'd already reached her. Her jaw had been torn off. A pierced tongue hung limp from what remained of her head. Face bruised, one eye torn out. A zombie's finger entangled in her bloody hair. She kept tugging on Alan's coat, staring at him, until her belly was ripped open. Alan dropped the cat's paw. He waited for the end. But the dead at his back only pushed past him to feed on the girl. He watched with a blank expression as her breasts were bared, then torn away, and her ribcage shattered by insistent hands. He almost moved to join them and taste of her flesh. But again, he reproached himself and stepped away. He trudged past the dead, nudging those aside that were too focused on their eating to make way for him. In the distance, he saw the sun lowering and a passenger jet streaking towards the earth miles away. He heard a low, rasping chant and tried to follow the sound. All the dead had left their meals and were now walking towards the sun, towards the chanting. Passing a store window, Alan glanced at his reflection. He saw himself. He took up the chant and proceeded towards the judgment seat.
Voice by David Dunwoody, as read by Tonia Brown. Why? Stephen jerked awake and lay frozen in the dark, listening intently. The apartment was silent, but he knew something had stirred him. It sounded uncannily like the voice of his ex-wife. Why? He stiffened. It was her. But it couldn't be. She was halfway across the country, as far from him as she could afford to be, and she wouldn't come back. Would she? Lying flat, holding himself as still as fear would allow, he rolled his eyes down towards the bedroom doorway, a black void from which the falsetto voice had emanated. It wasn't that he feared Sarah, but the idea of the woman standing in his home in the middle of the night, crying. It seemed crazy. It was crazy. And if it was real, surely it was the precursor to something much worse. Quietly, and with as little movement as possible, he slipped out from beneath the bed covers and crept towards the door, at an angle, so as not to alert her. He reached into the hallway and flipped on the light. There was no one there. He had a clear view all the way to the living room and kitchenette. There was only the bathroom, the closed door on his left, and as he stood there in bare feet on the icy carpet, clad only in his briefs, hunched slightly as he listened, he heard the voice again, and it was coming from that room. No! The pitch of the strained cry was exact, just like that night, the last night, when he told her it was over and pushed her sobbing, protesting form out the door. Out to where, he had not known, or cared. She had family to help her out. He had nothing but the grating routine of their loveless marriage. Rid of her, he was without anything at all, and happy at that. Stephen grasped the bathroom doorknob and slowly twisted it. There were no sounds at all from within, no shuffling, no breath, nothing. It was as if he had been roused from bed by a memory rather than Sarah's actual return. Something about that resonated in him, and he grew colder. But he opened the door and peered inside. Empty. At least save for the shower, which had its curtain drawn. He flicked the light switch by the sink and whispered, "Are you there?" No response. He entered the room. The tile was colder than the carpet, making his toes curl. His fingers were already knotted into shaking fists. He knew the voice was real. Where was it coming from? He reached, trembling, for the shower curtain. If she was here, and in there, then there was no rational explanation. She was here to hurt him. God, he would have never thought she had it in her, but maybe he'd finally pushed her that far. Jesus, God, she could be right there, mere feet from him, separated only by a thin sheet, with a knife or a gun in her hands. Stephen raised his other hand over his head, ready to strike, as his fingertips brushed the vinyl. "Stephen!" He nearly jumped out of his skin. The strange falsetto had a tinny vibration to it. It was the vent cover, affixed to the wall above the toilet, rattling as the voice came through it. Stephen ripped the curtain back and stared at the empty tub. "Why, Stephen!" The voice was coming through the vent. He leaned in close to the grimy plastic cover, thoughts racing. Was the voice in the wall? Upstairs? In another apartment? The roof? What? Why? Why? He grabbed either side of the cover and tugged it. It came away with little effort, revealing a fan caked with black crud, behind which was a narrow duct that curved upwards. The whole thing was filthy, and a musty odor struck Stephen's nostrils. And something scrabbled up in the ductwork. He cocked his ear toward the open vent. There it was again, a light scratching. The bugs that infested this place. The thought of them clustering up here was nearly unnerving enough to make him forget the voice. Then, "You hurt me!" His head was almost right against the fan, and this time he heard the voice. He distinctly picked out several different tones. It was a chorus of tiny voices, coming together in that odd falsetto which sounded almost like Sarah. Almost. But it was not her. It was an imitator. Imitators. No, she would never have come back. And now that he heard the voices clearly, they were not her own. This was a separate matter, for which there was a rational explanation. Reaching for the fan switch, he turned it on. The vent spat black flakes in his face as the fan came to life. He spun away. For a second he thought the insects had come spraying out at him. Disgusting! More crud shot out, but he let the fan run, thinking it might somehow stifle the voices. If they knew he was awake, maybe they would fade away and restore the normalcy he expected of the waking world. After a few minutes he turned the fan off. The tile was littered with dark flakes that had come off the duct walls. He shook a few bits from his feet. "You hurt me!" The voices grew in volume, becoming unnatural as they did so. There was a buzzing underneath it all, a buzzing and scrabbling, and he started to think that maybe they were the damn bugs themselves. Blood-curdling, he threw open the cabinet door beneath the sink and rifled through its contents. Had to be something he could spray up here. He knew he didn't have any insect killer, but there was Windex, bug killer for poor people. He snatched the half-full bottle and twisted the nozzle open. "You hurt me! Stephen!" "Shut up!" he growled, and shot several streams of the blue fluid into the vent. It drummed against the ductwork. The voices grew louder. "Stephen!" "Shut up! Go away!" He tore the top from the bottle and sloshed its contents into the vent. A storm of black, buzzing things showered over him. He threw the bottle with a sharp cry, flailing his arms about as the things, big, heavy bugs, bounced off his head and scrabbled over him, their wasp-like drones filling his ears. And then they were on his ears, pushing their mandible and swollen heads inside and shrieking, "You hurt me!" He stumbled back into the door. It slammed shut, and he fell onto the tile, thrashing madly. They were all over him. They were stinging. His face a rictus of pain, he screamed with all he had, but there was no sound to be heard in his head. No sound but the voices. "Why?" All the feigned human emotion left the cries, and they became an alien noise, little more than the frantic buzzing of insects acting out the anger and anguish they had been imprinted with. The years of Sarah sitting in here, on the toilet, sobbing and pleading, whether he was there to hear it or not. Sarah, irrepressible, who was never really gone. He beat his head against the floor. His eyelids were swollen shut, and he felt tiny legs clinging to the orbs of the eyes themselves. Felt this hot needle of a stinger. His head grew thick and heavy, and he was only vaguely aware when they poured into his mouth. Still he heard the voices. It was all he heard, until he didn't hear anything at all.